The morning sun painted the dusty main street of Willow Creek in shades of amber and gold, but Clara Martinez felt nothing but the familiar chill of isolation. As she stepped out of her modest seamstress shop, the wooden sign above her door creaked in the desert wind, its faded letters spelling out Martinez tailoring in script that had once been elegant, now weathered by years of neglect and the town's collective cold shoulder. Clara pulled her shawl tighter round her shoulders, not against the warmth of the day but against the weight of dozens of judgmental stares. As she walked toward the general store, conversations died like candle flames in a sudden breeze. Women gathered their children closer, as if her very presence might somehow contaminate their precious innocence. Men tipped their hats in acknowledgement, but refused to meet her eyes, their politeness as hollow as tumbleweeds rolling down the street. The reason for their disdain was simple and cruel. Clara was unmarried at 28, a cardinal sin in a town where a woman's worth was measured by her husband's success and the number of children at her skirts. Worse still, she had dared to establish her own business, refusing the advances of the town's eligible bachelors who saw her beauty as something to be owned rather than cherished, her olive skin, inherited from her Mexican mother, and her fierce independence had marked her as different, dangerous, other. But Clara had learned to wear their scorn like armor. Her fingers, skilled from years of precise needlework, had built something beautiful from the scraps of their rejection. Her shop might be on the outskirts of town, but her craftsmanship was unmatched. She created garments that transformed the ordinary into the extraordinary, each stitch a small act of defiance against a world that had tried to make her small. The bell above the general store door chimed as Clara entered, and immediately the conversations around her shifted to whispers. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife and unofficial queen of Willow Creek's social hierarchy, stood near the counter with her usual circle of devoted followers. Their eyes followed Clara's every movement as she gathered her supplies: thread, buttons, a bolt of beautiful deep blue wool that had just arrived from Denver. "I heard he's been alone out there for 3 years now," Mrs. Henderson was saying, her voice carrying just enough volume to ensure Clara could hear every word. "That McAllister ranch is falling apart, and he's too proud to ask for help. Mark my words, that man needs a good woman to set him straight." Clara's hands stilled on the fabric as she listened, her heart unexpectedly quickening at the mention of Thomas McAllister. She had seen him perhaps half a dozen times in the past year, always alone, always purposeful in his movements. There was something about the tall rancher that intrigued her, the way he carried himself with quiet dignity despite the obvious struggles he faced, the kindness in his green eyes when he thought no one was watching, the gentle way he had helped her retrieve her scattered packages when she had stumbled outside the bank last spring. "But who would want him?" whispered Mrs. Campbell, the preacher's wife, her tone dripping with false concern. "He's so rough, and that temper of his, remember. What happened to the last hired hand who tried to cheat him?" "Thomas McAllister is a good man," Mrs. Henderson said firmly, though Clara detected the calculating gleam in her eye that suggested she was already planning which of her friend's daughters might be suitable. "He just needs someone to soften those hard edges, someone respectable, of course, someone who understands her proper place." Clara paid for her purchases in silence, her mind churning with thoughts of the mysterious rancher. As she walked home, she noticed a figure on horseback at the far end of the street, silhouetted against the setting sun. Even from a distance, she could tell it was him. Thomas McAllister sat tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders carrying the weight of his solitude like a heavy coat. There was something in his posture that spoke to her own loneliness, a recognition that made her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. That night, Clara worked by lamplight in her shop, her fingers moving with practiced precision as she began crafting something special. The deep blue wool felt like silk beneath her hands, and she found herself imagining how it would look on Thomas's strong frame. She had been saving this fabric for something important, and somehow, she knew this was the moment. For 3 days, Clara poured her heart into the creation. She cut the fabric with careful precision, her experienced eye knowing exactly how to shape it to complement a man's broad shoulders and lean waist. The stitching was meticulous, each seam perfectly aligned, each buttonhole precisely placed. But it was the embroidery, that truly made the shirt special. Tiny dessert flowers along the collar and cuffs, stitched in gold thread that caught the light like captured sunshine. These were the flowers that bloomed in the harshest conditions, symbols of resilience and hope that Clara felt deep in her soul. As she worked, Clara found herself thinking about Thomas McAllister's story. She had heard whispers of his tragedy, how his young wife Sarah had died in childbirth 3 years ago, taking their unborn child with her, how he had retreated to his ranch like a wounded animal, shutting out the world and its offers of sympathy. The townspeople spoke of him with a mixture of pity and frustration, unable to understand why he wouldn't simply move on, remarry, and resume his place in their carefully ordered society. But Clara understood. She understood the pain of being judged, of being found wanting by people who claim to care about your welfare. She understood the strength it took to stand alone, to build a life from the ruins of broken dreams. Most of all, she understood the loneliness that could hollow out your chest until you felt like nothing more than a shell going through the motions of living. When she finished the shirt, Clara held it up to the lamplight, admiring the way the golden threads caught the glow. It was more than clothing, it was a message, a gesture of understanding from one lonely soul to another. She had sewn into every stitch her own experience of isolation, her own hard-won wisdom about finding strength in solitude. The next morning, Clara wrapped the shirt in brown paper and tied it with a simple string. She sat at her small desk and wrote a note in her careful script. For someone who understands the strength it takes to stand alone, you are seen, you are valued, and you are not forgotten. From a friend who recognizes your worth. She waited until the town was quiet, then made her way to McAllister's ranch. The property stretched out before her like a promise, vast, untamed, but full of potential. She could see the house in the distance, modest but sturdy, with a wide porch that suggested evenings spent watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. The fence posts were weathered but still standing, and despite the talk of neglect, Clara could see evidence of recent repairs, signs that the man who lived here still cared about his land, even if he had withdrawn from the world. Clara left the package on the porch step, securing it against the wind with a small stone. She didn't wait to see his reaction. Some gifts were meant to be given freely, without expectation of acknowledgement or return. As she walked back toward town, the desert wind whipping her skirts around her legs, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in years: a lightness in her chest, a sense of connection to another human being that transcended the boundaries of propriety and social expectation. Maybe, just maybe, she had found someone who would understand that being different wasn't the same as being broken. Someone who knew that the strongest flowers were often the ones that bloomed in the most unlikely places, nourished not by the approval of others, but by the fierce determination to survive and thrive despite the odds. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories from the Old West. Clara's simple act of kindness is about to change 2 lives forever. What will happen when Thomas discovers this unexpected gift? Will he understand the message behind the beautiful shirt, or will fear keep him from reaching out? Find out in the next chapter. Thomas McAllister's weathered hands trembled slightly as he untied the simple string that bound the mysterious package. The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows across his porch where he sat in his favorite wooden chair, the one his father had carved decades ago when this land still held promise instead of heartbreak. He had found the package when he returned from checking the cattle, and the sight of it had stopped him in his tracks. No one had left him a gift in over 3 years, not since the well-meaning but ultimately painful casseroles and condolences that had followed Sarah's death. The brown paper crinkled as he unwrapped it, revealing the most beautiful shirt he had ever seen. The deep blue fabric seemed to capture the color of the sky just before dawn, when the world held infinite possibilities and the harsh realities of day hadn't yet intruded. His calloused fingers traced the delicate embroidery along the collar, tiny dessert flowers, stitched in gold thread, the same wildflowers that Sarah used to gather during their evening walks when she was carrying their child. Thomas's throat tightened as he examined the craftsmanship. Every stitch was perfect, every seam aligned with mathematical precision. This wasn't just a shirt, it was a work of art. created by someone who understood that beauty could exist even in the most practical things. The fabric was soft beneath his rough hands, softer than anything he had worn since his wedding day, and he could smell the faint scent of lavender that clung to the fibers. He unfolded the accompanying note with trembling fingers, and the words hit him like a physical blow, not of pain, but of recognition. For someone who understands the strength it takes to stand alone. You are seen, you are valued, and you are not forgotten. From a friend who recognizes your worth. Thomas read the note 3 times, his eyes burning with unshed tears. Someone had seen him, truly seen him, not the bitter widower the town whispered about, not the failed rancher whose grief had made him an object of pity, but the man beneath the scars. Someone understood that his solitude wasn't weakness, but survival. That his withdrawal from society wasn't surrender, but a strategic retreat to heal wounds that ran deeper than bone. He held the shirt against his chest, feeling the weight of the care that had gone into its creation. Somewhere in Willow Creek, someone had spent hours thinking about him, crafting this beautiful gesture of recognition and acceptance. The thought was both humbling and terrifying. For 3 years, he had built walls around his heart, carefully constructed barriers that kept the world at bay. This simple gift threatened to tear those walls down with nothing more than kindness. That night, Thomas lay awake staring at the ceiling, the blue shirt hanging on the chair beside his bed like a question mark in the darkness. He thought about the note, about the careful handwriting that spoke of education and refinement. He thought about the embroidered flowers, so delicate and precise that they must have taken hours to complete. Most of all, he thought about the courage it must have taken for someone to reach out to him when the entire town had written him off as a lost cause. The next morning, Thomas did something he hadn't done in months. He looked at himself in the mirror. His reflection showed a man carved by hardship, deep lines around his green eyes, a beard that had grown wild from neglect, shoulders that had learned to carry too much weight. His clothes hung loose on his frame, evidence of the meals he had skipped and the care he had stopped taking with his appearance. But when he put on the blue shirt, something changed. The man looking back at him seemed worthy. The fit was perfect, as if the mysterious creator had studied his form and tailored every inch to complement his frame. The color brought out his eyes, and the careful embroidery added a touch of elegance that reminded him of the man he had been before grief had consumed him. Thomas wore the shirt to town that day, his first visit in over a month. As he rode down Main Street, he noticed something different in how people looked at him. Instead of the usual mixture of pity and avoidance, he saw surprise, curiosity, and something that might have been approval. Mrs. Henderson actually smiled and nodded from her position outside the bank. The blacksmith, Jim Torres, called out a genuine greeting instead of the awkward silence that usually marked their encounters. Looking sharp, Thomas, Jim said, wiping his hands on his leather apron as Thomas tied his horse to the hitching post. "That's a fine shirt you've got there. Haven't seen you looking so much like yourself in a long time." Thomas nodded, unsure how to respond to the compliment. "Thank you, Jim. Just thought it was time to make an effort. Custom work, that is," Jim continued, his experienced eye taking in the precise stitching and careful embroidery. "I'd recognize that craftsmanship anywhere. Clara Martinez makes the finest garments in 3 counties. You're lucky to have found her." The name hit Thomas like lightning. Clara Martinez, the seamstress who lived on the outskirts of town. The woman the ladies whispered about with a mixture of envy and disapproval. He had seen her occasionally, always alone, always moving with quiet dignity despite the town's cold treatment. She had been the one to help him gather his scattered papers when the wind had caught them outside the bank. She had been the one to nod respectfully when others looked away. She had been the one to make this beautiful, thoughtful gift. Thomas spent the rest of the day thinking about Clara Martinez. He remembered glimpses of her, the way she held her head high despite the whispers, the gentle way she had helped old Mr. Peterson when he stumbled outside the general store, the fierce independence that reminded him of Sarah in her younger days. She was an outcast, like him, but she had found strength in her solitude instead of bitterness. That evening, Thomas sat on his porch wearing the blue shirt, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. He thought about the note again. from a friend who recognizes your worth. Clara had given him something more precious than clothing. She had given him recognition, acceptance, a reminder that he was still a man worth knowing. For the first time in 3 years, Thomas McAllister smiled with genuine warmth. He had been alone for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to be seen by another human being. Clara's gift had awakened something in him, a desire to be worthy of the kindness she had shown, a curiosity about the woman who had the courage to reach out when no one else would. The next morning, Thomas did something that shocked everyone in Willow Creek, including himself. He walked into Martinez Tailoring, the blue shirt a badge of courage on his chest and hope beating in his heart. For the first time in years, subscribe to our channel to see what happens when Thomas finally meets Clara face to face. Will she be surprised by his visit? How will the town react when they see the lonely rancher and the shunned seamstress together? The next chapter will reveal the moment that changes everything for both of them. The bell above the door of Martinez Tailoring chimed softly as Thomas McAllister stepped inside, his heart pounding with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. The shop was small but immaculate, filled with the rich sense of fabric and thread that spoke of creativity and careful craftsmanship. Bolts of cloth lined the walls in every color imaginable, and half-finished garments hung from wooden forms like promises waiting to be fulfilled. Clara stood behind the counter, her dark hair pulled back in a simple bun that revealed the elegant curve of her neck. Her hands were busy with delicate embroidery work, the same golden dessert flowers that now adorned his collar. When she looked up and saw him, her eyes widened in surprise, and he watched a blush spread across her cheeks like sunrise over the desert. For a moment, neither spoke. Thomas felt the weight of the town's judgment pressing down on him. A respectable widower shouldn't be seen in the shop of an unmarried woman, especially one with Clara's reputation for independence. But then he saw something in her dark eyes that made his decision for him. Recognition, understanding, the same loneliness that had been his constant companion for 3 years. "Miss Martinez," he said, his voice rougher than he intended, "I wanted to thank you for the shirt." Clara's hands stilled on her embroidery, and she set it aside carefully. "You didn't have to come here, Mr. McAllister. I know it's complicated." "Nothing about kindness is complicated," Thomas replied, his words carrying more weight than he had intended. "This shirt, it's the most beautiful thing I've owned in years, but more than that, it made me feel human again." Tears glistened in Clara's eyes, and Thomas felt his heart crack open just a little. Here was a woman who understood what it meant to be an outsider, who had found the courage to reach out despite the risk of rejection. She was beautiful, not just in the conventional sense, but in the way that strength and gentleness could coexist in one person. "I'm glad," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant sounds of the street. I hoped you might understand what I was trying to say." Thomas took a step closer, drawn by the vulnerability in her voice. "I do understand, and I'd like to know the person who made it, if you'd allow me." Over the following weeks, Thomas became a regular visitor to Clara's shop. At first, he came under the pretense of needing repairs or alterations, but soon they both abandoned the pretense. They freely talked in a way that Thomas hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. Clara spoke of her dreams, her struggles, her refusal to compromise her independence for the sake of social acceptance. Thomas shared his grief, his guilt, his fear that he had forgotten how to be anything other than a broken man. The town, of course, was scandalized. Mrs. Henderson organized her ladies' auxiliary to boycott Clara's shop, though their efforts were largely unsuccessful since Clara's skill was unmatched. In 3 counties, the preacher gave sermons about the dangers of improper associations, and the gossips worked overtime crafting stories about the unsuitable attachment between the grieving widower and the headstrong seamstress. But Thomas and Clara had found something stronger than the town's judgment. They had found each other. Every conversation revealed new layers of understanding, new reasons to admire the courage it took to live authentically in a world that demanded conformity. Thomas began to see Clara not as the town's outcast, but as its most honest resident. Clara began to see Thomas not as a broken man, but as someone who had loved so deeply that grief had nearly consumed him. 3 months after their first meeting, Thomas arrived at Clara's shop with a proposal that surprised them both. "Come to dinner at my ranch tomorrow," he said, his green eyes serious. "There's something I want to show you." Clara's heart fluttered with anticipation and fear. A single woman visiting a man's home alone would fuel the gossip mill for months. But looking into Thomas's eyes, she saw something that made her brave. "I'd like that very much." The next evening, Thomas helped Clara onto his horse. His hands strong and gentle as he lifted her up behind him, she wrapped her arms around his waist, feeling the solid warmth of him. Threw the blue shirt her shirt and allowed herself to hope for something she had never dared. Imagine. They rode to a hidden meadow on his property, a valley where wildflowers grew in impossible abundance despite the harsh desert climate. Purple lupines, yellow desert marigolds, and red Indian paintbrush created a tapestry of color that took Clara's breath away. In the center of the meadow stood a small wooden cross, weathered but carefully maintained. "Sarah loved this place," Thomas said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "She used to say it proved that beautiful things could grow anywhere if they had love and patience." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. She knew how much courage it took for him to share this sacred space with her, to let her into the part of his heart where his wife's memory lived. "She was right," Clara whispered. "It's the most beautiful place I've ever seen." Thomas turned to face her, his green eyes intense with emotion. "Clara, I need to tell you something. When you left that shirt on my porch, you saved my life. I had given up on everything: hope, joy, the possibility of connection. You reminded me that I was still a man worth knowing." "Thomas," Clara began, but he gently took her hands in his. "I know the town talks about us. I know they think we're both damaged goods, too broken to deserve happiness. But I don't care what they think anymore. You've taught me that being different isn't the same as being broken. You've shown me that love can bloom in the most unexpected places." Clara's heart pounded as she saw the love shining in his eyes. "I've been alone for so long," she whispered. "I thought I was meant to be solitary, that my independence was all I would ever have." "You don't have to be alone anymore," Thomas said, his voice tender. "I'm not asking you to give up your independence, Clara. I'm asking you to share it with me, to let me love you for exactly who you are, the strongest, most beautiful woman I've ever known." The words hung between them like a promise, and Clara felt something deep in her chest unfurl like a flower meeting the sun. "I love you too, Thomas. I think I have since the moment I decided to make you that shirt." Thomas kissed her then, gentle and reverent, and Clara tasted the salt of her own tears on his lips. Around them, the wildflowers swayed in the evening breeze, and she understood that this was what Sarah had meant: beautiful things could grow anywhere with love and patience. 6 months later, they were married in that same meadow, surrounded by the wildflowers that had witnessed their first declaration of love. The ceremony was small, just a few friends who had the courage to celebrate their union. Despite the town's disapproval, Clara wore a dress she had made herself, simple but elegant, with golden desert flowers embroidered along the hem. Thomas wore the blue shirt that had brought them together, and when he looked at his bride, his eyes shone with the kind of love that transforms everything it touches. As they exchanged vows under the open sky, Clara thought about the journey that had brought them here, to outcasts who had found strength in their solitude, who had learned that love was not about fitting into society's narrow definitions, but about finding someone who saw your worth when the world had given up on you. The town of Willow Creek eventually accepted their union, grudgingly at first, then with growing respect as they watched Thomas and Clara build a life together. Based on mutual love and understanding, Clara's shop flourished and Thomas's ranch began to prosper again under the care of a man who had rediscovered his purpose. But more than that, they had proven that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the simplest acts of kindness, like a seamstress making a shirt for a lonely man and a rancher brave enough to wear it with pride. Thank you for joining us on this journey of love and redemption. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories from the Old West. Clara and Thomas proved that love truly can conquer all, even in the harshest landscapes of both the desert and the human heart. What other tales of hope and romance from the frontier would you like to see? Let us know in the comments below.